There we go. Okay. I'll go ahead and introduce our presentation. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'll go ahead and introduce our presentation and then I'll hand it off to Sierra. Um, so, as we were making our way through the interviews, uh, the theme of tribal sovereignty really stuck out to us in some of the topics that both Paul Plume and Dr. Jennifer Below were discussing. Um, in the 2010s and the past century, even, the issue of tribal sovereignty and autonomous government for the tribes of the plains has reared its head once more. And as we investigated some of the claims that Paul Plume and Dr. Villot made in their interviews, we came to the conclusion that the behavior of Governor Noem throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the behavior and decisions of the US Army Corps of Engineers throughout the past century, and the decisions of the federal and state government about the Dakota Access Pipeline all demonstrate a very callous disregard for the tribal borders outlined in the Fort Laramie Treaties of 1851 and 1868. And so we're going to discuss those three issues in that context um, as we make our way through some of the content from the interviews. So go ahead, Sierra.
Okay, the first person we have is Jennifer Below. She's from Yankton, South Dakota, and she is a visual artist and water security geographer. And then the second interview we used was Paul Plume, who is from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and is a teacher. And lastly, we used Lane Manson, who's from Brookings, South Dakota, and is involved with the SDSU Natural Science Department, whose interview focused on hunting, fishing, and farming on the Missouri River. So we mainly outlined three threats to tribal sovereignty, including dams such as the Big Bend Dam here in South Dakota, the pipelines such as the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the violation of the tribal checkpoints by Governor Kristi Noem. Here I have the letter from Kristi Noem to Tribal Chairman Frazier of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and I highlighted some important pieces. Here you can see the first highlight, she puts science and facts in quotation marks as a way to mock Tribal Chairman's first letter to her saying that we should confront COVID-19 with science and facts. And here I highlighted where she says, on US and state highways, there will be no tribal checkpoints. And that even though the US and state highways travel through reservations, she still tries to say that there will not be any more, or we will suffer consequences. So Mr. Paul Plume stated in his interview that the state of South Dakota could have looked to the tribes as an example of what they should have been doing. I think this clearly shows how the Native American community felt about Governor Noem's acts for the safety regarding COVID-19, and especially within the reservation. And Article 2 of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty states that all existing reservations on the east bank of said river, Missouri River, shall be, and the same is set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Indians herein named, and for such other friendly tribes or individual Indians as from time to time they may be willing. So this Article 2 states that the Native Americans get to choose who they want to come onto their own land. Not only did Governor Noem's actions violate the Fort Laramie Treaty, she also threatened to violate the Snyder Act of 1921, which was an act authorizing appropriations and expenditures for the administration of Indian affairs and other purposes. Here I highlighted where it says for the relief of distress and conservation of health. After the tribal chairmans Frazier and the Ogallala Sioux tribal chairman Julian Bearrunner did not take down the checkpoints after her request, she went on to threaten to pull away COVID relief funds as well as take away the law enforcement contracts that were already in place for the reservations.
So the next couple topics of our presentation both relate to water in South Dakota with relation to the tribes. And I'm going to go ahead and cover my topic first, which relates to various topics such as the dams put up on the Missouri River, flooding along the Missouri River, and generally just the usage of the largest river in our state. So flooding has always been a problem on the Missouri River ever since people have lived here. When winters where there's more snow, the river will flood, and it's a bad thing. So back in the 1930s and 1940s, the people wanted the government to start doing something about this. And so the government's response to this was to have the Army Corps of Engineers build a series of dams along the river in an attempt to stop the flooding and help alleviate that problem. The only problem with that was they did not ask the consent of the Native Americans living on the reservations, which were directly along the river. And so in a period of 1946 to 1966, this is a report from the Department of the Interior, the building of those dams directly flooded and made unusable 353,313 acres across such reservations as the Crow Creek, the Lower Brule, Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, Fort Berthold, Yankton, Rosebud, and Santee reservations all throughout the state, flooding all of that land without asking the consent of the Native Americans therein. This caused 3,538 Native Americans to be relocated because the land they were previously living on was now unusable and covered in water, and it affected a total of 6,900 Native Americans to varying degrees, be that relocation, ruining of crops, whatnot, so forth. And then the next primary source I found in relation to this topic was actually a hearing in front of the United States Senate. It was 5 years from the flood, oversights of the Army Corps' management of the Missouri River and suggestions for improvements. Field hearing before the subcommittee on Superfund waste management and regulatory oversight of the Committee on Environment and Public Works, United States Senate 114th Congress. During this Senate hearing, a man named Paul Episto, who is the Regional Conservation Coordinator for the Isaac Walton League of America, which is one of the largest conservation groups with relation to the Missouri River. He discusses how prior to the 2011 flooding on the Missouri River, they had petitioned the United States Army Corps of Engineers to put some more floodplains in to alleviate flooding, to work with local cities and communities to get zoning ordinances for said floodplains, and how the big drought that came immediately after the big flood shows that the Missouri River needs better management by the Army Corps of Engineers. And a direct quote from him during the Senate hearing, he said, "The river, in essence, is still operating on a 70-year-old business plan, and that review is urgently needed and long overdue." This just shows a long history of the United States' poor management of the Missouri River, which has led to direct infringements upon the sovereignty of the tribes here in the state. No, you're muted.
Could you go back to the previous slide for just a moment? I actually want to start there. So the most recent and glaring challenge to tribal sovereignty has got to be the Dakota Access Pipeline. Jennifer Velo highlighted some serious shortcomings in the U.S.'s management of water resources. Apparently, according to her, there are 33 separate agencies that monitor and enforce water regulations and standards. There's no Ministry of Water. There's no centralized agency that monitors this entire watershed that the pipeline affects. It's all split up between these little agencies that, you know, when everybody has different data sets and has to send those back and forth, results are very slow, disjointed. and it's hard to actually get a broad perspective on how wide-reaching the effects of such an endeavor as this pipeline are. And this is reflected in the sentiments of our Iowan neighbors, in that the state only requires a $250,000 insurance policy, basically, to be made by a private company like I think it's Marathon, that's the access pipeline, when building something like this, when in reality spills often result in millions or even billions of dollars in damage. So the federal laws and the state laws are simply inadequate to accommodate a project like this while actually keeping everyone's water supplies safe. Would you go ahead and go to the next slide? Conveniently, I actually found, while I was looking for charts to show you of the broader watershed and tributaries of the Missouri River, I found charts made by Dr. Villot that actually highlight, you can see in yellow here, these are reservations and native territories that border the pipeline, as you can see in red, and the Missouri River in blue. And this broader darkened area is the whole watershed. Basically, anything that happens in this darkened area affects the Missouri River. And all of these tributaries that you see, these little blue lines in this darkened area, go right into the Missouri River. And anything that happens north is exacerbated in the south, because the river is going to accumulate pollution, and carry it downstream. And as you can see, there are a number of reservations that border the Missouri River and rely on it as a primary source of water. Do you go to the next slide? Here's another chart that displays similar data, but it actually shows you the percentage of native peoples living along the river by county. That very dark green section right there is Standing Rock, which is the most famous one in North Dakota, where a lot of the major protests took place. Go to the next slide, would you? So this picture right here is courtesy of ABC News. I figured it was pretty illustrative. 18 million downstream. It's a tribal sovereignty issue, and it's also a broader human health issue that affects not just the native people, but everyone that lives in this area. It's a legal issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a health issue, it's a water security issue, and it's really kind of a horrible situation. The Iowa chapter of the Sierra Club expressed concerns about the federal government's use of eminent domain, which allows them to basically forcefully purchase private property for use in developments that benefit the public. But there really are very few discernible benefits to the public of Iowa, yet eminent domain was used to procure land for this development. The Standing Rock Sioux famously litigate the pipeline as a threat to their way of life, their water, their people, and their land. And I think that people often misconstrue this idea of their way of life as some antiquated and spiritual idea, when it really means just their ability to govern themselves autonomously, sustain themselves autonomously, and live healthily on the land that they currently own. A spill from this pipeline would be ruinous. Are you saying 2 minutes left, or? I'm not sure I understand that direction. Okay. A spill from this pipeline would be ruinous for the native people along its ability to sustain themselves on their own water supply. And the fact that this pipeline is still operating sets a very dangerous precedent. Every day it's still operating, it sets the precedent that tribal sovereignty and decisions made by their autonomous governments are unenforceable or insignificant in the face of bigger private economic interests. Some progress is finally being made. There's an environmental review underway with the pipeline. Several politicians in Congress are also currently pushing for the pipeline to be shut down during the environmental review, but we'll have to see what comes of that. But the past 3 years of this pipeline's operation are a disgrace as far as honoring tribal sovereignty and the treaties that were made with the people who lived there hundreds of years ago.